Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
Before we get started with this week's discussion, I have an announcement for all cognitive security and information thought leaders. And if you're listening to this podcast, that probably means you. We welcome your submission of original content suitable for our professional community. And we recently updated our article submission guidelines, and there is a link to this in the show notes. IPA is fortunate to have an informed and experienced readership with high standards. Our readers include defense practitioners and planners, government policymakers, journalists, academics, technologists, futurists, and venture capitalists. And so we seek to publish authoritative, experienced, and authentic voices who have something important to contribute to our generational challenge, cognitive security. And now on to this week's discussion. My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, who is a global futurist and expert in geopolitical risk intelligence. He is director of the Center for Futures Intelligence at the National Intelligence University, where he also serves on the research faculty. Jake Sotiriadis, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Great to be with you, John. Thanks so much for the invite.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Jake, will cover geopolitical risk, alternative futures, and national security. But before we get into these topics, or maybe these are all related topics, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Sure. Well, let me just start out by saying that the 21st century is not playing out at all how it was supposed to, in the sense that what we were thinking about, if we go back in time about 20 years, or let's say even 25 years ago, coming out of the 1990s, where we had the dot-com boom, a decade of economic growth in the United States in particular, but this notion that we have this idea about the future that things are always supposed to get better. There was supposed to be a peace dividend after the Cold War. And what we got in the 21st century, in many instances, I think, was not the rosy picture that people were predicting or people were talking about, particularly in the early 1990s. If we just take a quick look back, we got the September 11 attacks, which then created a 2-decade global war on terror, with devastating consequences for this country, for the United States, and for the world. We got the 2008 financial crisis, which shook not only financial markets, but more importantly, people's trust and confidence in capitalism as a viable way forward for the global economy. So you had this questioning of the traditional economic model that underpins the West. We had a pandemic that just happened a few years ago that we're still dealing with the consequences of. We had a rise of populism over the last 4 or 5 years, right? That didn't just happen. The seeds of that were planted before. But if we look at this, we have this very volatile period from the beginning of the 21st century, and we're standing right now at sort of this place in 2022 where the year is almost over, and we have a major conflagration. We have the biggest military conflict in Europe since World War II raging. So, how did we get here? Right? And more importantly, where do we go from here? Not only as the United States in strategic planning for the United States, but how do we as the international system, how are we going to regulate these crises and find our way out towards those aspirational futures that I think we talked about so much?
How far out does your thinking about the future go? I mean, are we talking 100 years out? Are we talking 50 years out? Does it depend? When you and your colleagues are doing your work, how does that fit into the picture?
Let me just provide a quick intro, if you don't mind, just about
Sure, sure.
what future studies is
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what it isn't, and then we can talk about the time horizons that you mentioned, because that's important as well. But one of the things I always emphasize whenever I give a talk and when I teach in the classroom and when I'm speaking to either seniors in government or even in the private sector is that future studies is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts today. And when you say that you're a futurist or you work in strategic foresight or future studies or futures intelligence, the immediate assumption is that you're predicting the future. And there could be nothing further from the truth. So right up front, future studies is really not about predicting the future at all. On the contrary, what it really does is it is a different way of problematizing how we view today's environment by making some basic assumptions problematic and then understanding how we can innovate from the future by identifying weak signals and emerging trends in today's environment so that we can develop anticipatory thinking and then ultimately make better decisions. And there are different shades of futures thinking as well. So there's a school, or there are many schools, and it probably would be exhaustive to sort of go through all of the methods and different approaches. But in broad terms, you have a lot of futurist thinking that tends to be in line with strategic planning, which is why it's become very popular in corporate circles, because people want to be able to have a better playbook of what to do. How should I react if my anticipated future doesn't play out? What are my options, right? How can I fall back on a different type of plan? Which is definitely great. That's not the only purpose for futures, though. There's an actual method to building aspirational futures. How do we want to shape the future? So that's sort of this forward-looking, how do I craft alternative future scenarios to build that aspirational world or organization or whatever unit we're talking about. So those are all important approaches. And then there's also sort of this critical futures approach that is out there as well today, which is taking a look at the current systems of power in the world and deconstructing them and saying, why is it that we have a privileged status for a particular economic system or political view or type of people or historical viewpoint? And how can we deconstruct those futures to then build different aspirational futures as well? So the time horizon piece that you mentioned before is important because different people will tell you different things on how we ought to approach looking at the future. In my experience, if we're going to be advising, and my experience is largely in the national security realm, so there is utility in doing a 30 or 40-year look, depending on the problem set. If we're looking at something like great power competition, if we're looking at something like geopolitical competition, or even military weapons systems, if we're talking about these things that are semi-quantifiable, if you will, you want to be able to understand what the strategic environment might look like, and then understand how you would be prepared to be able to to fight your way out of a scenario that you didn't anticipate when things are collapsing all around you. There's utility in that kind of a long view, but at the same time, future studies doesn't have to be limited to only a 30-year look or a 40-year look or a 100-year look. One of the things that we want to do in the national security realm, and what I teach and what I emphasize, is that we're not looking to create just an academic study that, and I don't want to say that pejoratively, not just, but an academic study that isn't going to be used. What we're actively trying to do and what we're teaching at NIU is how we can change the way we think to really impact our national security strategy, to impact our intelligence tradecraft. So we want to be able to give people tools that are going to make good analysis better analysis, that are going to make a good strategy a better strategy. And so what that often means is maybe making some smaller type changes to how we think that then will snowball, if you will, and lead to a broader shift in thinking within the national security establishment, sort of starting out small. So in order to do that, you don't always have to say, hey, here's the next 100 years of human history. I think that in many cases, you can also do a 5-year look or a 10-year look, depending on what it is you're trying to solve for, depending on what type of problem you're examining. So I'll give you a great example of one report that we put out at the Pentagon when I was still working as the Air Force's chief futurist, and we looked at some scenarios of geopolitical competition with the pandemic as the central source of disruption. And we picked 2035 as a time horizon. And this was done in 2020. So we gave ourselves a 15-year time horizon, and I'll tell you why. We wanted to be able to show some palpable effects in the not too distant future, but still a few budget cycles forward, in what this could mean for our organization, how we would not just be reactive, but how we could be proactive, how the environment might change, how things along the political, economic, technological, environmental spectrum might shift. So we thought that time horizon made sense for what we were trying to project. Now, it could be that if we're doing if we were using that methodology on a corporate client that wanted to have something a bit more near term, we'd say we'd take a 5-year look, and we could explain how some of those dynamics shift and what they might mean. And then you could still extrapolate out, a 10 to 20-year look. But I would say that the time horizon is very specific to either what your client is looking for, what your organization seeks to provide, or if you're just trying to throw away an established paradigm and you want to take that long look of a 30 or 40-year look, that's great too. Just recognize that there are limitations to each of those approaches, and it's important that that folks recognize that there are pros and cons to picking different time horizons.
Right. What are the various assessment methodologies that you and your colleagues use? And let me ask another couple of questions in this same space and ask you to take it in whatever direction that you think is productive. But so we started off this conversation with you saying the 21st century, just really hasn't started off the way we thought it would. So as far as assessment methodologies go, how do you and your colleagues change the various different input dials that go into your assumptions, right? For example, human nature presumably factors into some of the way you look at possible future worlds. So some people think that human nature is relatively fixed. Some people think that human nature is changeable, and those types of assumptions presumably can really affect future outlooks. You mentioned COVID as well. So for example, does our global response, or even our national response to COVID, change any of the way or any of the input assumptions for some of your methodologies? So again, I'd like you to take that in whatever direction you think is productive.
Sure. No, that's this gets to the crux of what we're trying to look at in terms of being futurist. And so maybe I'll start with a question, which is really, what's the value proposition of even having a futurist or having the capability? We're seeing that today more and more, where not only in government, but in particular in the private sector, which is where I like to look for where a lot of these important changes are going to come. We're seeing positions like chief futurist or chief futures officer in not only in the C-suite, but people that are sitting on corporate boards, and a skill set now that is demanded more and more. A great friend of mine and fellow futurist, Jason Schenker, has said that when he started doing LinkedIn searches for futurists, and I think he said about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that you came up with a handful of positions, right? And today, if you do the same type of search, it's in the thousands. So that just gives you a sense of, the demand signal for these kinds of skill sets. Why is that though? What makes somebody attractive as a futurist? Why would a corporation, why would a national security entity want to have a futurist? I think it really has to do with the fact that futurists are comfortable with being uncomfortable. They trade in the currency of uncertainty. And so being able to deal with uncertainty, being able to take the trajectory of culture, of a corporate culture, whether that's a business culture, whether that's culture and operational culture in government, and say, actually, we need to promote a better tolerance for uncertainty and see ambiguity increasingly as an asset instead of vulnerability, which is not something that's easy to do. It's easy to sit and talk about it. It might even sound intuitive. But this idea of shifting our cognitive processes towards a greater tolerance for uncertainty changes the way we envision the world we live in. It changes how we want to create aspirational futures when we talk about scenario building. And it actually, there's that psychological data that shows that when we promote this tolerance for uncertainty, it actually can lead to better decision making. There is additional data in the private sector that firms, and actually great academic studies that have been done that show that firms which promote a systemic way of thinking about the future in their corporate processes have increased profitability to the tune of over 100% over their competitors that don't have this kind of capacity. So I think the value proposition is quite clear. The difficulty, in particular in the national security and government realm, becomes the implementation. And that's something that I've experienced in the Department of Defense, in the intelligence community, in cooperation with foreign governments to see their approach on how they tackle these kinds of issues. It's not something that's easily, that lends itself to direct implementation.
Right. You bringing in the private sector considerations into this conversation, and so frequently on this podcast, when it comes to technology adoption, more often than not, we hear about the private sector outpacing the national security sector when it comes to necessary innovation in this competition that we find ourselves in. But I think I may be hearing, or if I were to armchair this thing, it wouldn't surprise me if you were to say that futurism as a capability, that the national security sector may be ahead of the corporate sector just a little bit as far as this kind of a capability. What's your hot take on that?
So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's ahead, and I'll tell you why that is. I think there's, number one, the national security sector has sort of a baked-in advantage in that futurist studies, futurism, strategic foresight, sort of had its origination in the defense establishment right after the Second World War.
That makes sense to me. Yeah.
So you had this, and it was this idea of some of the folks that were the early members of the Rand Corporation who were grappling with how are we going to deal with this emerging Cold War that was fresh for them. That was the issue of the day. This idea of thermonuclear war, folks like Herman Kahn, right? So all of these great minds that were thinking about how do we envision better futures, but also how can we implement these types of ideas in strategic planning. So that you had that natural formation around the don't forget the intelligence community, which was created in 1947. So all of this stuff happens generally around the same time. But this thinking has ebbed and flowed in popularity and in government circles back and forth. It sort of becomes in style, in one particular administration, or even tenure of a particular director or whatever, and then sort of leaves. There was a movement particularly in government in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, to develop what they called anticipatory governance, which is a great concept of doing exactly what it says, which is trying to be more anticipatory and increase futures literacy in government and taking sort of this long-term view of making decisions. But again, we get limited to things like election cycles and personal agendas and what I call the tyranny of the now, which is a huge problem. So I wouldn't say that the government is necessarily ahead. Also, I feel like there's a higher, maybe there's not even, maybe higher isn't the right word, but there's less of an appetite in many cases for adopting these new types of ideas in government than there is in the private sector. And it's very hard sometimes to shift very bureaucratic and established, not only processes, but frankly, old ways of thinking. When we look about like the military establishment, I'll give you an example. When we created our strategic futures and foresight branch for the Department of the Air Force, which was in the middle of, we sort of took off in the middle of the pandemic. I had made the suggestion in 2019 to create this capability, and was met with lots of skepticism and resistance. And why are we doing this? And aren't we already doing, all these sort of typical questions. But moved ahead anyway. And then when the pandemic hit, the response was, wait a minute, now get in my office right now. Let's talk about this. And which is exactly the wrong time to start thinking about these kinds of issues. But even within the Department of Defense, I still think that there's a resistance to much of this kind of thinking because it sort of is a paradigm shift away from the linear approach that the department uses to tackle problems, the way that we budget, the way we view acquisition cycles, the way that everything is sort of planned out in this very neat and organized way that fails to capture the emergent phenomena and the complexity that the current world is characterized by.
Right. And I'm reminded of a previous episode that we had with a colleague of yours. We'll have a link in the show notes to the discussion with Josh Kerbel as well, but he really hammers home the complex nature of the world that we inhabit right now. And the world's always been complex, but there's something special about the confluence of technological advancements, networks, the internet. Everybody's got a publishing device on their person where they can consume information from the world and provide novel information into the world, and it just really changes the game compared to the way things were just 20 short years ago. But keeping with the notion of information and competition, so every action that is taken in the world potentially has an effect, or it can serve as some sort of a strategic communications play. And so we are sending a signal out there into the world that we value futurism. We value thinking very hard and resourcing possible future scenarios. So adversaries should understand this. So why are we sending this kind of signal into the world, and what are we hoping to communicate, would you say?
Well, I think number one, the most important aspect of us adopting this kind of thinking, not just adopting it, but really providing an emphasis for it and proliferating it. Because if the biggest hurdle I've seen thus far to futures thinking, both in government and the private sector, is a lack of education. So the more we're able to communicate what it is, and maybe more importantly, what it isn't, is, I think, going to make a difference. And it pays dividends in how we think strategically and how we change this sort of traditional linear way of thinking. So the proof, as they say, is going to be in the pudding. The message that we want to send to not only our allies and partners, but to our adversaries alike, is that we recognize that there isn't one singular future and that the future itself doesn't exist, but there are always multiple possible futures that are constantly in flux. And within each one of those future scenarios are always clear winners and clear losers. That's really the value proposition of doing a scenario planning exercise and using scenario planning in both defense and business. So we're sending the message that we have this capability. We want to use it so that we can make sure that the United States and our allies and partners are always going to be on the winning side of whatever scenario may emerge. And that's one important piece of it. But I think in tandem, we also want to make sure that we don't believe our own press all the time and that we're constantly challenging our own assumptions. I think that's equally important, as well as the external messaging. Just because we develop something that's called a national security strategy, just because we develop something that is a corporate plan, just because we develop, let's say, an intelligence strategy or approach, doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right recipe for the time we're living in. In many cases, it tends to be that we've written something that actually talks about a prior problem that we still can't wrap our brains around, and we are tailoring a strategy, right, which we can have a debate on what the word strategy means and if it actually has meaning today because it's so overused, or innovation, same thing. And how we're actually going to innovate from the future, how we're going to examine the weak signals in today's environment, and are we going to use this methodology to check our own assumptions? When everybody agrees on a particular vision of the future in a room, run away, raise a red flag. This is a huge problem, and yet it happens again and again and again and again. So this gets back to what I talked about, which is promoting this tolerance for uncertainty and having this healthy questioning of the status quo, which is so necessary when we talk about something like national security or the private sector as well, or business.
Right. What tends to be the drivers of outcomes? Like what are the big mega, drivers that inform, future outlooks, would you say? There's like probably a couple, two or three that come to mind for you.
There are, and it depends again on which analytic model we're using, and we could have, like I said, multi-hour long discussion on different methodologies. But I would say a good framework to look at, where you have a baseline approach of drivers, is called the STEEP framework, which stands for scientific, technological, economic, environmental, and political. So if you cover that framework, you're going to be accounting for lots of the trends, or a lot of the trends that will become drivers, and then understanding that these weak signals that may seem today, and they should frankly seem today like they're on the fringe, if they're out in the mainstream, they're not weak signals, right? They've already become strong signals. So this idea of understanding how to do the analysis, how to not only just look at what are the emerging trends, but then put everything together to be able to move out of the present and then create this possibility for new futures, even when everything seems like it's okay, right? I think that's probably like I said, it's being comfortable with really being uncomfortable, and saying that, hey, we may have an approach today that we think is meeting our goals, but as we saw with the pandemic, things are going to change on a dime, and then what? And that's where I find we struggle to create momentum for futures thinking. And it's a natural thing in government. There's a natural resistance to this because bureaucracies are sustained by maintaining the status quo. So when you come into an organization, I mean, if you go to, to use a sports analogy, if you go into, the team's locker room that just won the Super Bowl, and you say, "Hey, coach, this was great, but you need to change the playbook," you'd say, "Well, why would I want to do that?" Right? This is the winning model. Yeah, it was the winning model for the team that you just played. It's not going to be the winning model for the team you're going to play tomorrow, or the next game, or the next year, or in the next 10 years. So communicating that value proposition. So strategic communications is as important, I think, to promoting futures thinking as the methodology itself, in particular in government.
This has all been fascinating, Jake. Maybe we could take this into the applied zone here. So what is some of the recent work that you and your colleagues have been engaged in?
So one of the projects that I'm most proud of, John, that I think really hits all the points we talked about previously, is a recent collaboration that our Center for Futures Intelligence at National Intelligence University has with the Greek government. And this is something that started, interestingly, as a sort of an innocent LinkedIn conversation about, hey, what is it that you do, that then blossomed into an important building partnership capacity effort and analytic exchange with a major NATO ally, one of the United States' top allies in Europe, and a critical partner for peace and security in the Eastern Mediterranean and also in the Middle East. And so I was able to travel in March to Athens and took part in what we called a Future Lab 2035 workshop, where I led a series of discussions with the National Security Advisor of Greece, representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, their defense establishment, their intelligence establishment as well. And we actually went through a 3-day exercise of envisioning alternative future scenarios, but also questions about the future of European security after the Ukraine crisis. And I will tell you, it's one thing to examine these kinds of things from an American perspective. It's something completely different to be in Europe and to be with a major European ally and envision these kinds of scenarios and understand the difference in focus from a European perspective and what that should mean to us, right? So it was a wonderful opportunity to really dig into some of these details. I'm excited to say that report that we're jointly publishing is going to be released here next month in September. So take a look out for that. That's going to be an unclassified report that's released. And there'll be 4 different scenarios that we examined that take into account all kinds of things: cybersecurity, the current conflict in Ukraine, different future repercussions that could come out of that, the geopolitical competition that we see, and also the technological nexus to that and what that means, transatlantic relations, global governance, all sorts of great issues that went into that report that I think are going to have lasting and important impacts on both sides of the Atlantic.
That's excellent. And we will have a link to that report in the show notes as soon as it's available. So I'd like to start wrapping up, if I may, Jake. So we have students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful research question that is related to these kinds of things that we've been discussing that an interested student might take a crack at?
Yeah, this is great. So being in the Office of Research and teaching classes on this and problematizing is one of the things we like to do as futurist researchers. So I think there's different approaches that one can take when we think about future studies and methodologies. Number one, I think I would encourage students to really get steeped in the different approaches to futures. So recognize that there isn't any one particular way of quote unquote doing futures that is the right way. There are multiple methodological approaches to this, things like backcasting, things like a causal layered analysis, things like the scenario development that I talked about, things like, they have the futures wheels, right? So I won't belabor this and list all of them, but there is a robust academic literature on future studies that I think we need to spend more time learning from, because what's happening, as you and I talked on this episode, there's a bit of a popular culture element of futures now that's out there, and you hear people talking about it on podcasts, you hear about it in the media, you hear about it even from government and the private sector. So there's this aura of, oh, I want to do futures, and I think what gets lost in that is that it isn't just doing futures, it's I liken futures studies and foresight to really the sort of the cherry on top of the cake. So you've got to know something. It's future studies itself I think lends itself best to established areas of expertise. So if you have a particular focus area that you're already working in, and then you're applying this futures methodology to it, then you can broaden your horizons. I think there's a bit of a misperception in a lot of cases where people just want to sort of do futures for futures sake, which of course anybody can do, but I think a lot gets lost in that. So what we try to do when we say focusing on a futures related question is, how are we questioning the status quo now? What particular areas perhaps don't make sense, or where do we see vulnerabilities, or where do we see opportunities that we think could be different? And then how do we capture this idea of emergent phenomena in the current strategic environment to sort of push our thinking forward? So when we talk about something, and I'll give an example, like great power competition, which is this big nebulous thing, which some people say is sort of masking as a strategy, right? The concept is sort of great power, which I would argue is not, great power competition is not a strategy. It's characterizing, an attempt to characterize the present environment, rather than just saying, what's the trajectory of great power competition. We might look at peripheral issues that are going to shape the global strategic environment. Things like, how do future ideological models portend a systemic shift in how foreign policy decisions are made, or how do these emergent phenomena, things like economic phenomena and societal phenomena, societal shifts, or perhaps shifts in perception, how do those impact our ability to understand or map the trajectory of change that's coming? And this is something that we talked about right at the beginning, right? The way that we collectively envisioned how the 21st century was going to look, right? This was supposed to have been, even in the defense establishment, in the right before 9/11, there was this idea that we have flexibility now. We have this ability to streamline and to reduce the size of our standing footprint, and we can get into these small mobile units, and right, and we're going to focus more on disruptive technology and develop 5th and 6th generation aircraft. All of these things that we're still working on, but then the United States defense establishment, got sidetracked, and the threats that we were looking at were things that we found in our kitchen, things that became IEDs, that were constructed to produce IEDs, and that was the greatest threat to the most powerful military in the world for a time. So how do you reckon with something like that? How do you shift that paradigm to be able to have the intellectual flexibility to say, okay, now what? I think that is one of the most important value propositions of today, is not how we see the competition right now on August 22nd, 2022. It's how are we going to develop that anticipatory capacity to see beyond what's happening and to envision how we would be prepared to deal with a series of phenomena that we probably aren't considering right now.
Great. There were probably like a dozen questions baked into that answer. That's awesome, though. That gives everybody a lot to think about. Last question, please. What's a good book or other online resource that you could recommend to somebody? Like what's on your nightstand, or if somebody is thinking about a career in future related studies, what's something that you could suggest here?
Yeah, well, there are so many great titles that inform futurist thinking, and I don't want people to think that in order to be a foresight expert or to be an aspiring futurist that you only are reading books about futurism. On the contrary, I would actually say you need to start with some philosophy. I would say you need to understand how we can glean the insights of history so that we understand some trajectories within human history, because what we're trying to do is anticipate change in society as well, not just emergent phenomena in other realms. So I would say, you do yourself a favor to really be steeped in what I love, obviously ancient Greek philosophy. I think a lot of the discourses that you're going to find in Aristotle and Plato are very relevant, in particular for history. Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War is kind of said it all in terms of a lot of the foundational concepts that we use in IR. But I think in terms of practical thinking on futures and just this idea of envisioning different outcomes, you've got some great books like Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I think that they give a nice overview of different levels and phases of thinking. You've also got Peter Schwartz, The Art of the Long View, I think is a popular book that does a great job of explaining the value proposition, not only of scenario planning and development, but also strategic foresight. So I would start with those. And then there's also a great book called Thinking in Time, which is May and Neustadt, and they do a great job of looking at sort of the instances or the uses of history by decision makers. You notice I keep coming back to this history piece because
Yeah.
One of the things I like to say is that historians tend to make the best futurists. Because if you're going to envision alternative futures, or if you're going to try to understand sources of disruption in the present environment, you have to understand what those sources of disruption were in the past and how and why they may or may not be different today, and why, if we're going to be looking into the future, they may or may not be different then. So those are all important bookends, I think, to sort of put this all together.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I was going to ask you actually about how does an understanding of history play into futurism? And I think you just answered that. It's critical. It's critical, and also with your mention about philosophy as well. Having some kind of understanding of human nature and reality is critical as well. It sounds like.
It is, and I think what's so important today, and this is maybe one of my critiques about what we're teaching today in our educational approach, is that with something like philosophy, you're giving this new generation a tool with which to grapple with this idea and make them okay with uncertainty, right? So what's wonderful about philosophy is that you're not necessarily trying to get to the right answer.
Yeah, the concept of the right answer just kind of like dissolves as you get down into foundational philosophical issues.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about problems in the strategic environment that are linked to human nature, as you talked about before, you realize very quickly that you're not going to just be able to quant your way, if you will, out of a problem. And a lot of some of the disciplines today, even of political science, international relations, and those academic streams actually in many cases are trying to become more quant-centric, and they want to use quantitative methods, which is great on the one hand because you're getting some really interesting methodological approaches and robust data sets. But when you're looking at problems like the origins of war, or if we're talking about things that are human behavior centric, it's almost, in my opinion, impossible to use a purely quantitative model to determine future trajectories. And you've almost got to have this qualitative approach. Both are important. Both are equally important. I wouldn't privilege one over the other, but I think, particular for a futurist approach, there's real value and richness to using this qualitative method, where most future studies fall under.
Yeah, well, that is an excellent note to end on. You've given us a lot to think about. And with that, Jake Sotiriadis, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.